This slideshow is just a quick little set of images to go along with the James Dietz book and Small Things Forgotten, to give you some examples, some visuals to go along with the ideas that he discusses in that book. Of course, in Small Things Forgotten, Dietz is looking at archaeological evidence from New England and looking at types of artifacts and their different traits over a period of time. He maps out 3 different phases of Anglo-cultural development in New England before the Revolution. And in particular, he's mapping the emergence and decline of specific kinds of spiritual imagery, the emergence of new forms of ceramics or pottery, and then, of course, changing ideas of house form, all of which move us culturally towards a more individualistic, ordered, controlled, and balanced worldview, which of course is part of the Enlightenment influence that we see in the eras before the Revolution. So he's really trying to trace the change of worldviews through the changing form of material objects. And he's also looking specifically at those 3 areas that we talked about in the form and pattern slideshow that all artifacts have. There's the formal dimension and the physical aspects of the artifacts. This would include the imagery. And then he's also looking across time by creating series of artifacts and mapping the rise and fall of specific cultural traits. And then, of course, he's looking at this across in a very concentrated space. So in this case, kind of the space is fixed, the time changes. If you remember our kind of synchronic and diachronic diagram. So let's look first at gravestones. This is one of the areas where he really has a clearly defined sense of these 3 periods. We see the emergence and then the decline of the death's head, giving way, overlapping with and giving way to a cherub image, and then finally the urn and willow. And as Dietz discusses, these represent 3 different distinct ideas of spirituality and worldview, particularly the role of supernatural, the nature of death and mortality, and changing ideas of also the individual within that. So we get this kind of move from the skull to a much more individualistic cherub figure, which have very specific kinds of human faces, a softening of an idea of the afterlife, and then finally the neoclassical imagery of the Revolutionary period and after in the willow and the urn, which reflects a kind of emerging culture of sentimentality around death and also the memorialization of specific individuals. Next, let's look at pottery. And again, Dietz is mapping out different phases of both the formal characteristics of ceramics, but then also the specific kinds of artifacts that emerge, both with technological changes and then also with changes in worldview. He starts, of course, in early New England with the communal serving and consumption of food in these trenchers that are where everybody kind of has their knife or their spoon and is, sopping up the communal stew, moving to an increasingly individualized idea of place setting, utensils, and food service. So we see first the emergence of earthenware for cooking and serving food. And you can see here now we're starting to see like individualized drinking glasses, specific kinds of more specialized forms of ceramics, and also a kind of higher level of craftsmanship. Then we see the emergence of stoneware, and again, increasing individuation. These are cups for drinking. Here's a chamber pot, a beaker. And then eventually this gives way to glazed earthenware, and then eventually creamware and pearlware, where we see this kind of whitening of ceramics through the glaze and then the application of transfer prints with a variety of different kinds of imagery, often exotic, natural, or Asian, in the case of porcelain. And Dietz is really linking this to this kind of increased idea of order and control in the Enlightenment, ideas that we humans are increasingly separated from nature as opposed to being linked to nature. And we'll see this also in architecture as well. And then this, of course, is an example of pearlware. This is tied to technological innovations, the emergence of Staffordshire potteries in England, and the increased importation of goods from Britain, which also reflected this kind of new sensibility that colonial New Englanders had about their place within the British Empire and their rights as individuals within that empire. And this is just an image of a variety of ceramics and glassware that were excavated from the trash pit of the estate of Captain Stephen Phillips, who was a sea captain in Salem, Massachusetts, right smack dab in the middle of this later part of this period that Dietz looks at. And you can see that there's a mix of kind of functional pieces and then also higher level creamware, pearlware, and then also we have, again, this very individualistic, the teacups with the saucer, and we're kind of at the height of that individuation and more ritualistic, individualized consumption of food and beverage. And then finally with houses, we see a shift away from traditional New England house form, like this salt box house. And one thing you'll notice about these houses that Dietz talks about is that they have a central chimney and then also an asymmetrical facade, right? So we have the 4 windows on one side and then the door. And if you look here, again, we have an asymmetrical facade. It's not completely the same on both sides. This is definitely characteristic of New England architecture in a pre-Georgian period. And here's yet another example of that. And of course, this house, then house also eventually becomes a salt box house, what's called a salt box house, and with the addition of a rear L, single-story L on the back of the structure. Now, this is significant because it's the transformation of a traditional Holland parlor house into this, with the addition of this back L. And you'll see here that almost in most cases, what we see is that becomes a kitchen or a workspace. So we also see the addition of often a front porch or here a foyer space. So instead of coming directly into the house, which we would have done in a prior example, we're coming in, we're into this area here where we're kind of negotiating, separating ourselves out, and then you could go into either spot, and then, the workspace is toward the back of the house. This is, again, kind of taking the disorder of cooking and work and kind of separating it out, part of that Georgian emphasis on control and order, which we see kind of epitomized in Nathaniel Hawthorne's birthplace. And then, of course, in the full expression of the Georgian ideas. And here we see the embodiment of that kind of Enlightenment idea. It's a very ordered and symmetrical facade. Everything is equal on both sides. We have 3 to 5 piercings in the front facade. And we also see that now we have, also 2 chimneys, one on each side, and this becomes the kind of quintessential Georgian architecture. This is a very good example here in New Hampshire. And then this one, the Derby House in Salem. I don't think you can get much more quintessentially Georgian than this house. And then we also see sometimes in the later period the addition of this kind of Greek revival portico on the front of the house over time. These houses get added on to. Here we have the kind of inclusion of an L off the side of the house that we see sometimes in New England in the later period. And then, of course, the Georgian form eventually morphs into what becomes known as the I house, which becomes a predominant vernacular house form across particularly the southern United States. And often we'll see that plantation plain or plantation homes are basically iterations of the I house, a chimney on each side, and then a symmetrical front here with the central door and then the piercings of the windows around it. Again, Dietz does look at this both over the diffusion of this form over space and time. And if you think about, I talked a little bit about diffusion in the form and pattern slideshow. Again, looking synchronically and diachronically, we can sort of map out the migration or the diffusion of these different house types from New England out across west through New York, Ohio, and eventually to the upper Midwest. And here you'll see this is that kind of L house with the addition on the side that I just mentioned becomes very common in the Midwest. And then finally, I just wanted to give you some images, an image related to Parting Ways, which is the African American site that was excavated at Plymouth Plantation. And of course, Dietz devotes a chapter to that. And this is a site of the actual excavation of the Turner Burr House. This is the sketch that is in the book, and then this is a photograph of the house of the house at Plymouth Plantation. It's part of the Plymouth Colony Archive. And then this is an example of some of the earthenware jugs that were found at Parting Ways. And you can see, this is the same period that we see, in the house of whites, you would see creamware or pearlware. And in the African American settlement, we see this kind of persistence of earthenware and then what's called colonialware. So that's just a few images to illustrate what you saw, what you read about in the Dietz book.